Let's think about the Teachers College in our hearts and minds, which touches every corner of the world every day. What is Teachers College? It's the epicenter of education, health, and psychology. It is nearly every school system, community health program, and multicultural counseling program in the United States and beyond. But it's also a coffee cart on West 120th Street. It's a speeding number 1 train. It's the early morning sunlight over Morningside Park. And at this uncertain moment, it's a way of being in a complicated world. Teachers College is the stuff that dreams are made of. It is a canvas on which each successive generation paints its murals. It's a universal library where we add our collective masterworks. It's a mixing board to lay down our tracks alongside the greats. Teachers College is Harlem, where we work with educators learning the neighborhood's proud history and legacy of resourcefulness and indomitable will. TC is America's community colleges, which are a gateway for underserved populations. And TC is also indelibly New York City, where we are helping schools transition to online education, bringing critically needed medical equipment to major hospitals, and providing psychological services, even as the current crisis touches us personally. But Teachers College is also Bangladesh and Lebanon. TC is Ecuador and Peru. It's Ghana and Cambodia and Bolivia. It's China and it's Europe. On almost every continent, we find TC, creating and improving schools, bringing physics to young people worldwide through hip-hop pedagogy, giving displaced people new hope, working with indigenous populations to preserve their own languages, helping children with cleft palate reclaim their lives, empowering children with autism to utter their first words. All of these people, states, and countries are Teachers College, as are all the places our students call home. It's everywhere that our graduates are shaping a healthier, better educated, more equitable, and more joyful world. TC is in our hearts and minds, as well as in every corner of the world.
Hello, I'm David Sadowsky, Assistant Director of the Arnhold Institute and the EDD program in Dance Education. I hope you enjoyed Dr. Perpiner's talk. To learn more about additional TC events celebrating the Harlem Renaissance, visit the Arnhold Institute Symposium website. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our next guest speaker this evening, Dr. Marianne Laverty, and her talk entitled Charles H. Williams and the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group. Dr. Laverty is currently an instructor of gifted dance education for Virginia Beach City Public Schools. Her career has included serving on the faculties of Woodside High School, Hampton University, Christopher Newport University, and New York University. She received her Ph.D. from New York University and her M.A. from Mills College. Dr. Laverty has served as president for the National Dance Society and the National Dance Association. She's the 2006 recipient of the Dance Teacher Magazine Outstanding K-12 Teacher of the Year, the 2009 National Dance Association National Dance Educator of the Year Award, and a 2011 CERDNA Education Fellow. Dr. Laverty's research on Charles H. Williams is published in Finding a Way Out, Charles H. Williams and the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group. Her book is available for purchase in the virtual Arnhold Institute Symposium bookstore, which can be accessed from the symposium website. Welcome, Dr. Laverty.
Hello, I'm Marianne Laverty, and I would like to thank the Arnold Symposium for inviting me to share my research on Charles H. Williams and the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group. The time frames that are depicted on this screen are 1934 to 1948, and that is a time frame that Charles H. Williams served in the capacity as director of the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group. In this presentation, we're going to look at a brief history of the Hampton University, a timeline of Charles H. Williams' accomplishments, the founding of the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group, the dance group's repertoire, co-contributors to the group, and then Charles H. Williams' overall contributions. So if we look at a map of Hampton, which is on the far eastern shore of Virginia, this gray shaded area is the campus of Hampton University. Across the water right here is old downtown Hampton. This long, thin peninsula is Fort Monroe, which is now a historic landmark. And then directly above it is Buckrow Beach, which we may or may not have time to talk about today, but that is another major accomplishment of Charles H. Williams. So we're going to start with the Civil War, and in 1861, Hampton, Old Town Hampton, was burned. Now, the Union soldiers had control of Fort Monroe, so if an escaped slave could make it to Fort Monroe, they were considered contraband of the Union Army, and they were not returned to the South, and they were able to fight for the Union soldiers as the Negro units. On retreat from Hampton, like I said, General Magruder burned it because he did not want the Negro soldiers housed in white homes. Now, that contraband group of former slaves formed a large, it was called the Grand Contraband Camp, which is where Old Downtown Hampton was. And then in post-Civil War, because of the situation there that was burned, and there was kind of a shanty town built on top of the rubble, and also because of contentions between the newly freed slaves and poor whites, the Northern American Missionary Association decided to build Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in 1968. Now, that was the original name in 1968. Later, it's going to change in 1922 to Hampton Institute, when there was kind of a push for a more academic program because they felt that the education they were not receiving was not on the same foothold as other white institutions in the United States. And that normal degree was a 3-year program that is comparable to like an elementary education today. And then later in the 60s, it's going to be changed to Hampton College, and then finally in the 80s to Hampton University. So I may go back and forth saying Hampton Institute or Hampton University, just depending on the situation or if I slip. So here's another historic landmark on the campus. This is Emancipation Oak. And in 1861, when that contraband camp was in the area of Old Downtown Hampton, there became the first acknowledged and supported again by the American Missionary Association school for children of former slaves, and it was taught by a free African-American woman named Mary S. Peake. It's also the site of the 1863 reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it stands as a historic landmark at the entrance of the university. And you can see the picture on my right of it originally in 1861, and then photographed by myself. It's very heavily branched nowadays as it stands and looks today. Now, the war ended in 1865, and as part of that Reconstruction, that was kind of brought about by, number one, Brigadier General Samuel Chaplain Armstrong. He was in charge of the Negro units during the Civil War, and it was sort of his brainchild, and also with the funding from the Northern American Missionary Association. And it was at the site of the Union Hospital, Camp Hamilton. And the intent behind creating this institution was to give the newly freed slaves a viable occupation, and also there's a focus on education so that those who are educated would go forward and then educate the community. Now, Charles H. Williams, you can see, had a very long life, lived to the ripe old age of 92. He was born in Kentucky in 1886, and he was raised by an aunt who was a former slave, and she promoted hard work and education as a means of having a successful life. Now, he was attending Berea College, which was an interracial college, and in 1904, Governor Day passed a law and actually brought them up on criminal charges, Berea College, that African Americans could not attend school with white Americans within a 25-mile radius. So in 1905, Charles H. Williams transferred to Hampton Institute and graduated as a painting major with that normal degree in 1909. Now, this was not a fine arts degree. This was painting exterior and interior buildings, and later he's going to go on to be influential in creating and building architecture on campus and off campus as well, and innovating several buildings. And this is how he would have looked upon graduation in 1909. Now, granted, that was a, like I said earlier, that the normal degree was comparable to an elementary education, but because of his intellect and his efficiency, the Hampton University created a physical education department in 1910 and asked him to serve as department chair. Now, he was reluctant at first. Being an athlete himself, he still had fallen from a ladder painting the administration building, and one of his legs was rendered partially immobile, so he was hesitant to take the position, but the Board of Trustees offered him a 4-year master's program at Harvard, which he would finish later, but he had first attended Springfield College for his bachelor's degree. And for those dance historians out there, remember Ted Shawn was teaching at Springfield later on. Now, when those students first arrived at Hampton, and I think Booker T. Washington arrived there, I think in the 1870s, those students were sleeping in pup tents. So Hampton Institute really needed funding to construct buildings on site. So they initiated a funding initiative to get funds to build up buildings, and it was called Singing Up Hampton. And there was first a colored and Indian Hampton chorus that performed Indian ceremonials and tableaus of plantation life. I might add that Hampton Institute had a large Native American population, and they were inmates from the Red River Wars in Florida, and they had sent letters around to various institutions asking them to take the Native Americans, and 2 colleges took them. One was Hampton Institute, and the other was the College of William and Mary. Now, and also Booker T. Washington was in charge of those Native Americans when they came to Hampton Institute campus. So early on, they were performing, and programs in the university archives go back to 1914, when they had an 85-foot schooner that would travel up the Atlantic coast, stopping off at major cities and ports, going all the way up into New York to perform. At Carnegie Hall and at Brooklyn Academy of Music are some of the significant places that they were performing at. I already said in 1910 they developed a physical education program, and they offer Williams an incentive to get his master's at Harvard, which was considered one of the best programs in the country. Now, here's another way that Charles H. Williams offered access to African Americans into the greater, say, university arena, where he, in 1912, co-founded the Colored Intercollegiate Athletic Association, the CIAA, which allowed black schools to compete in sports. Now, Charles H. Williams was a department chair. He was also a coach. And so you look at some photographs in the archives and you see those Native American students are part of those football, basketball, and baseball teams. So not only was he giving black athletes the ability to perform in athletic competitions, but Native Americans as well. And he did begin his BA at Springfield University, and that program for physical education did require that those physical education majors take dance classes. So coming back to the campus, he wanted to include dance in the PE curriculum, and he did meet some initial opposition to that, but he proceeded forward and started staging what they were called physical education demonstrations outside on the lawn of Armstrong Hall. Now, those original programs had many European dance forms, maypole dancing, I've seen pictures of Chinese dancing, and also things like gymnastics and vaulting and that type of thing too. In 1918, he was sent as a special investigator in World War I to Europe to investigate propaganda or negative propaganda concerning the Negro units in Europe. And some of the propaganda was that the the Germans were trying to persuade the African American soldiers to come over to their side based on their treatment within the United States, giving them the incentive that if you came over to the German side, we would treat you much better post-World War I. The other negative propaganda was that the Negro soldiers were raping American women, and I'm only saying Negro because that's what they were called at that time frame. So, and then later he published a book called Sidelight on Negro Soldiers, which is still available on Amazon if you are interested. Another important thing that happened on campus was he was one of the co-founders for the Hampton Musical Arts Society, which brought in musical groups and dance companies to Hampton, one of them being the Dineshon Company in 1924, which is the same time he completed his Bachelor of Arts in Springfield College. Now, the next incident I have on here is important because I think it sets his mind frame that African Americans should have equal access to all performance venues. And the Anglo-Saxon Club, which is a branch of the Ku Klux Klan, attempts to force segregation on campus. Now, if you remember me saying that early on, there's always been integration on campus. And in one of the original dance company members from 1934 that I interviewed, who grew up on campus, said it had always been integrated. So the Ku Klux Klan is trying to force segregation on campus. So how Charles H. Williams combats this is through persistence and letter writing. So he writes to every major newspaper in the United States. He also contacts all Hampton alumni who had a legal degree and overturned that decision. And here is Ogden Hall. It was built in 1918, and that is going to become the major performance venue on campus that is still used today. If you can see a little bit to the left is Virginia Cleveland Hall. That was the first dormitory on campus that was built up from Singing Up Hampton. And then the second building was Wigwam Hall, which was the dormitories for the Native American students. So, like I said, Dineshon visits Hampton campus in 1925. If you go look at one of their newsletters from 1925, they talk about Hampton as being so gracious and hospitable, and the food was wonderful. Now, another thing that happened while he was at Springfield, he had approached one of his dance instructors and asked why there wasn't the inclusion of African American dance forms within their curriculum. And she kind of implied that she didn't know that people such as him had dances. So that kind of prompted him to start research on plantation dances throughout the South and gather material and eventually publish his book called Cotton Needs Pickin', which was reviewed and praised by John Martin in the New York Times, praising his efforts and acknowledging that something like this had never been accomplished before. And then in 1930, he completes his master's at Harvard. 1931, Ted Shawn purchases Jacob's Pillow. In 1932, he's selected as an Olympic Committee member and attends classes at SCU and writes curriculum for junior and senior high school physical education for Negro children. So he's very prolific. And I don't think he's necessarily acknowledged at that aspect of his life sometimes. And another thing that really prompted his interest in presenting Afrocentric material on stage was he attended the 1933 Chicago World's Fair Century of Progress, and one of the exhibits was called Darkest Africa. Now, that sounds very derogatory now, but at that time frame, that is how Hollywood was portraying Africa and African dance, such as movies and Tarzan. And what he noted from this demonstration of different African dances was that it was performed with dignity and pride and respect for their culture. And it was indigenous African people from many places throughout the continent. And when he came back to Hampton University, he did two things. He published an article on it in Southern Worker, which was published on campus. And he also sought out some indigenous Africans on the campus who were actually performing themselves, and they were called the African Quartet, and they were from various parts of Africa too. And so he starts his research in authentic African dance, and he eventually has them set those pieces on the company, and they are company members themselves. So again, some of the things that really prompted him to start collecting Afrocentric material and presenting it on a concert dance stage was at the conclusion of World War I and the celebratory parades for armistice, he noticed that all of the other nationalities and actually some African countries were represented in the parades and were performing their national dances, but there was no sign of the honoring the African American soldier who contributed to World War I. So that was something that stood out in his mind. And again, that teacher who was insensitive to recognizing that African Americans did have their own cultural heritage of dance, and he felt a need to preserve that, even though if you think of plantation dances, there's also a negative connotation of just acknowledging that existence, but you can't ignore that existence, but acknowledging it and recognizing it as cultural heritage and recognizing the need to preserve it as part of the history. And then again, attending that Chicago World's Fair and seeing African dance presented in a very dignified manner. So how it sort of came about, and note the time frame. This is prior to Katherine Dunham's debut in New York City in 1937, I believe, 37 or 38. So prior to that 1934 Ogden Hall performance, all we saw were those physical education demonstrations outside on the lawn. We didn't see any programs. And I also need to note that I heard someone speak from Columbia that he was saying I think I read the programs that Ted Shawn were presenting. Charles H. Williams presented a very similar type program in terms of how they were arranged on the program. So he did have a direct, Ted Shawn and Charles H. Williams did have a direct connection, and you can see that influence between the two of them. So that performance had the African pieces on it. It had the labor rhythms on it, and it still had at this time frame some of the European folk dances on it. However, it was very well received. And then in 1935, Charles Williams sets up the opportunity for the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group to perform at the Mosque Auditorium in Richmond. Now, this is not a religious temple. It is just a theater named the Mosque, and it's still there today, and it's still being used today for large performance, as a large performance venue. And this is very significant performance because of what it springboards or propels him into the limelight by first being the first off-campus performance ever. It's the first time an all-black group performs in an all-white venue, which in 1935 is in a southern segregated state, is saying a lot. And it's the first time they're actually reviewed by the press. And that success of that performance kind of prompts him to start this large barrage of letter writing, and he is a meticulous letter writer, and he starts targeting, first off, Hampton alumni. He's also writing to other historic black universities, and there's something at Hampton University called the Ministers' Conference that was going on early on, and hundreds of ministers come every summer to this conference. He had access to that contact list, so he was sending letters to all these ministers trying to find venues for his group to perform. Another thing that really formalized the group was that once Jacob's Pillow came into existence and Bennington festivals came into existence, he was up there every summer from 1934 to 1938. Also, Ted Shawn returns to Hampton and sets Cutting the Sugarcane on the group, the Mosque performance in Richmond. And then another really significant thing that happens is that Charlotte Moten Kennedy comes on board. Now, Charlotte Moten, or Charlotte Moten Kennedy, sometimes you see her as referred to Charlotte Moten Hubbard, was the daughter of Robert Moten. Robert Moten was a Hampton Institute graduate and succeeded Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee University as president. Charlotte Moten grew up on Tuskegee and then later graduated with a physical education degree in dance from Sargent College, which was also had a direct relationship with Harvard. And later on, she's going to go on into become quite high up in the Reagan administration, and there's files on her as well as her father at the Library of Congress. By going up to Bennington and Jacob's Pillow, Charles H. Williams meets John Martin and Margaret Lloyd and enlists them in their aid, and they write about him and favorable reviews and print PR for him. Also, Louis Horst presents an article about them in his magazine Dance Observer. So in 1937, they make their New York debut at the 92nd Street Y, and also at Horseman Theater at Columbia University and the Lafayette Theater. And they are reviewed by John Martin, Walter Terry of New York Herald, Margaret Lloyd, Christian Science Monitor, and Louis Horst. Was not a review, it was just an article on them. And again, he receives favorable reviews from John Martin and Margaret Lloyd. However, Walter Terry's are not so complimentary, but that's kind of Walter Terry saying that the American Negro, where's their place, where's their niche in the modern dance. And he also felt that the European folk dances did not serve them in the best interest, and so they're going to drop those European folk dances from their program. Another significant accomplishment was they were approached by the National Folk Festival, and they made their debut in Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. Now, the reason why that is so significant is because Marian Anderson, the opera star, was not allowed to perform at Constitution Hall just a month prior to their performance because she was African American. And they continued to perform at the National Folk Festival for the next 4 years. So here is another performance venue that they have breached those taboos of African Americans performing there. And then in 1945, they make a film that was produced by IBM. Willard Pictures was an offshoot that did documentary films, and it was called Album of Americas. Now, in the archives, there is storyboards for them to perform various pieces like Boogie Woogie, Cakewalk, The Blues, but the only piece that made it into that film was Cotton Eats Pickin', and I have a little excerpt to show from that. And then again, they perform in New York in 1956 for the unveiling of the bust of Booker T. Washington at one of the buildings. It would have been in Upper East Side, New York, and it is no longer in existence and no longer owned by NYU, and I don't know what happened to the bust of Booker T. Washington. But they did like a piece that was called The Life of Booker T. Washington, and that's another thematic piece that they had where they would reenact the life of Booker T. Washington. And so some of the major accomplishments of the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group, between 1934 and 1948, they performed over 80 times in the northeastern, southeastern, and midwest of the United States. And they received guarantees of up to $500. Now, this is Depression time, post-Depression time, and during World War II, which those fees today would be somewhere around $3,000, $4,000. So that's a significant amount of money. However, they were touring large groups with their singers, and then they had chaperones of about 45 students and adults, either by train or by bus. Again, they were going as far down as Florida and up into Massachusetts. Later, and remember he went to Berea College, he was still continuously writing to Berea College, stating his desire to bring the company back there so they could see the accomplishments he had made. They never did perform there. They performed at Kentucky State University, and this was during World War II. They were also getting command performances by the military to perform. As they were touring at other historic Black colleges and universities, they influenced those schools or institutions to start dance within either their physical education program or dance as an individual curriculum itself. And I know he directly influenced Spelman and Howard to start dance programs there. Now, the other astonishing fact is these were not professional performers, these were physical education majors. And as they would come through the program, they would graduate after 4 years, and over 200 students went through that dance company from the time frame of 1934 to 1948. And you can't really prove the influence that Charles H. Williams had on physical education and dance in programs throughout the United States. But if you think of all those students coming out of that program, there's no way that they could not have acknowledged his educational philosophy and his influence to include dance in physical education. So some of the repertoire that went through the program during that time frame were work songs, like Dussel Hammer, Cutting the Sugar Cane, plantation dances, like Cotton Needs Pickin', African dances, and I think that the African quartet said at least 7 pieces on the company, spirituals, and modern works, and like I said, European dances were later dropped from the program. So this is an example of one of the labor rhythms called Dussel Hammer. And again, we could say this could have negative connotations of maybe a chain gang or a workforce. However, like I said before, that it is part of their cultural heritage, and there's a beauty in it too, like the kind of rugged, the ruggedness of men dancing and working and chanting. And these pictures are quite beautiful, and they come from the Hampton University archives. This is Cotton Needs Pickin', and again, the negative connotation being on the plantation that someone might be happy picking cotton as long as they're singing and dancing and doing it. But again, it's part of their cultural heritage. So I'm going to show you a little video clip. This came from the IBM archives in a huge canister, and I had to have it digitized.
From the Negro's genius for song and rhythm has sprung much of the musical development of the Americas, especially the United States. As the cotton pickers went down the long rows, filling the bags that would be weighed in at the end of the day, they found their task lightened by the rhythm of their song. We had a heart by summer, that's why it opens so soon. Jean Ball, Barbara Southall, Ronnie Hayes, and Curtis James perform the dance, while Hattie Bright, Clarence Cooper, and Henry Kemp sing off stage.
Now, by the time frame that we're looking at today, you might say this is not very sophisticated or technically, challenging, but these were plantation dances. And as they're naming the students who are performing here, throughout the Hampton Roads area, some of these dancers continued on and were quite successful in having a large number of people come through their studios. And I even run into people today who had studied with some of the former Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group. This is a picture of one of the African pieces, and I found receipts in the archive that these are traditional drums that he purchased in Shields. And this is one of Charlotte Moten's pieces, Finding a Way Out, and you can see that there is a more of a 30s, 40s modern dance look, a Gramish look in terms of the shape and the costuming. And I might add that Charles H. Williams did study with Martha Graham and Hanya Holm, and also brought them to campus as well. And like I said, I interviewed one of the original dance company members, and I just thought this was interesting that she stated that the males rehearsed separately from the women in different spaces, and they only came together in the theater when it was time to perform. So I have read accounts where it seemed as if Charles Williams had done all the choreography, and that's not the case. Regardless of how much I admire him, it doesn't diminish that. He did set some of the early plantation dances, such as the cakewalk and the Dussel Hammer, and some of the early spirituals as well. Now, some of the pieces he did write down, and there's notes for each of the dances that he did choreograph, and even the African pieces. He did bring Ted Shawn down to set Cutting the Sugar Cane. He did hire Louis Shalif to set the European pieces. That's early on. And he continually wrote to like Native Americans, Haitians, trying to encourage people to come set other pieces on the company as well, too. And there was times that there was student pieces in the programs. But I really think it was Charlotte Moten who really set the tone of the repertoire and really brought in, I think, more of a social justice aspect to some of the themes of the choreography. Some of her pieces were Middle Passage, Finding a Way Out, Tramping, that type of thing, where it seemed to have a little bit more of a edgier context in terms of the social justice element. Here's just a little chart. We don't have to go through all of that. The other thing I want to note is that after Charles H. Williams retired from the directorship, the themes, choreographic themes started to change. And after he retired as department chair in 1951, they significantly changed things like Christmas in the Toy Maker's Shop. And at that point, there was a lot of disgruntled dancers. A lot of them quit, refused to perform. And it wasn't until, I think, the 60s when there's some strong figures come back, like Dr. Jean Braxton, E. Nina Butts, and really put it back into kind of the original thematic material that focused on Afrocentric material. And they're still going strong today. So in conclusion, I wanted to say that Charles Williams not only founded the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group, he was a coach with an unsurpassed winning record at Hampton University and inducted into the Virginia Sports Hall of Fame posthumously in 1981. He is a teacher, administrator, writer, researcher, businessman, Hotel Association president, and civil rights activist. I just want to briefly say that he bought a large piece of land in 1933 that was on Buckrow Beach, which was previously segregated, and built a hotel and a dining hall, dance hall, bumper cars, Ferris wheel, and it was coined as a place in the sun for African Americans to enjoy themselves. And there's a whole huge history on the Buckrow Beach and the Bayshore Corporation too as well. He was a man of great integrity and a leader in his community and an uplifter of his community. He opened pathways of access to Black and Native American athletic competition, hotel and vacation areas for African Americans, and that was one of the reasons why he became the hotel, or bought a hotel and became the Hotel Association president, so that African Americans would have access to hotel stay. But primarily, his access to dance education for African Americans and performance venues, and advocated for the inclusion of African American historical cultural dance forms within the educational and performance arenas. So I hope I've given you a little bit of information. There's so much more that is to be discovered and researched, and much of it is in the Hampton University archives. So I invite you to come down and visit the museum. It's a beautiful collection of both African and Native American and photographs of the early times on campus at Hampton University. Thank you so much.
Hello, and welcome to the 2021 Arnhold Institute Symposium. I'm Ted Warburton, Senior Fellow of the Arnhold Institute, and this is the question and answer session with Dr. Marianne Laverty. Dr. Laverty and I are joined by Laila Sales and Carol Garcia, who are doctoral students in the dance education program. Welcome to you all. Dr. Laverty, it is wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It's such an honor and pleasure to be here, and it's great to see you again, too.
Your research on Charles H. Williams has taught us so much about the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group, which inspired students and audiences alike with its use of Haitian and African cultural and spiritual themes in the modern dance genre. Our field of dance education owes you a debt of gratitude for highlighting the importance of Mr. Williams' seminal work. But his work was not without some controversy. And so I wanted to ask you a question. I wanted to ask if you could please speak more about the Hampton Creative Dance Group's experience while touring and performing, given the controversial nature of including African, indigenous, as well as African American plantation dances in their repertoire during the 1930s and beyond.
Well, initially when I started my research and my writing, I had thoughts that there would be some trepidation and some hesitancy to perform those types of work, especially in the South in the 1930s during the Depression time era, and especially for the 1935 performance at the Mosque Auditorium in Richmond. That was their first off-campus performance. Again, they were in the South in the 30s. It was Depression era. There were, tales of lynching still. And that was in a previously all-white venue. And they were performing works that included Negro spirituals, work songs, labor rhythms, later some Haitian works too, and African works. And this is prior to Catherine Dunham coming to New York and making a big name for herself too. I recently did reread Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up from Slavery. So I had a little bit of shift in my thinking process. Hampton Institute, as early as the inception of it, was traveling with a group of singers with General Armstrong, who was the founder of the Institute, and they were performing spirituals and work songs. And then later, when Booker T. Washington became the president of Tuskegee, General Washington toured with Booker T. Washington as well. And they called this process Singing Up Hampton. It was to raise funds for the building. And like I said, later on with Booker T. Washington for Tuskegee. And Booker T. Washington was wildly popular, and he really had these wealthy patrons, both white and Black, who really welcomed him into society. And so even after General Washington's death and Booker T. Washington's death, Hampton continued touring. They even had an 85-foot schooner that would travel up the Atlantic coast. And they were performing in Boston. They were performing at Carnegie Hall, Brooklyn Academy of Music. And at this time, they started to implement some plantation dances. And so all I can say now, I'm thinking that maybe Booker T. Washington kind of set a precedent or expectation of the type of material that would be coming out of Hampton. But again, the 1930s was a different time frame than the 1800s. But the other thing that Charles H. Williams did, I don't know if he did it purposefully to ensure there was a kind of a semblance of protection, but he always traveled and performed under the auspices of a local Hampton Alumni Association. And so they would stay with these families, and they were housed and fed by the families. Now, at that time frame, African Americans weren't readily accepted into hotels. And so henceforth that Green Book, and also later on prompted Williams himself to buy a hotel in 1933 called the Bayshore Corporation, because him and his wife had been denied access to hotel accommodation. So another thing they did was they toured to a lot of historic Black colleges and universities where they would stay in the dormitories there. Another thing he did, he was a great letter writer, a great PR person, and he would there's something called the Ministers Conference at Hampton University still today, and it was back in that time frame too as well. And so he had access to all these connections of ministers, both Black and white, because that's indicated in his letters, inviting them to come to the performance and sending PR materials, as well as to school districts in the area, and to all the local newspapers. And in those PR campaigns, he would always talk about the educational importance and the rich cultural heritage of Hampton, and where those those songs came from. And so I think the way he prefaces it maybe kind of opened doors slightly, but I did. The other thing too was that his relationship with Ted Shawn, and there was pieces from Ted Shawn on the program. And he was also, because of his frequent visits to Bennington and Jacob's Pillow, he was friends with John Martin. John Martin had reviewed his book, Cotton Eats Pickin', back in 1928. And he also was friends with Margaret Lloyd, Martha Hill, and like I said, John Martin too as well. And so he always sent out, especially prior to that 1937 New York tour, had sent an article to Louis Horst, and he had published that in the Dance Observer. And John Martin had published something for him, and then he had reviews by Martha Lloyd. Now, they weren't always favorable. I'm just going to read one thing. Margaret Lloyd says, it was a dance picture of the culture of a race, of the sources of that culture, of the tributaries that fed it, and of the race's emergence into respected citizenship as a contributing factor to American art and American life. It was presented with taste and discretion by an educated man whose innate and cultivated love of the dance has turned his life work into its present course. Now, Walter Terry of the New York Herald Tribune called it exciting and valuable, along with frankly boring creations. He attributes Shawn and Helen Tamaris with having more effective spirituals than the Hampton group, but calls it their work songs and their characteristic rhythm pieces and their African pieces exciting, but not creative, as indicated in their the name of their group, the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group. He tells them to leave the modern pieces alone and do dances that were more innate to their abilities, so to speak, and to let the white modern companies perform the modern pieces. So he writes Martha Hill and asks for a frank, analysis of or synopsis of the performance. So she writes, number one, it's only 1937. The group's only been in existence since 1934. She said that they're still in a developmental stage and they're really focusing on form rather than the performance aspect. She said not to be discouraged though at that point. And then also, I was able to interview one of the original dance company members, Mrs. Elaine Cook, who was a member from 1934 to 1938. And I asked her quite, bluntly, like, how did it feel coming out of a segregated Southern state and going to relative freedom in those Northern states? And she said she didn't feel any difference because she said the Hampton campus had always been integrated, which it was. However, she would have been 4 years old in 1925 when the Ku Klux Klan tried to shut down the campus and segregate it, especially Ogden Hall, the performance venue. And Charles Williams himself had written to all the newspapers in all the major cities throughout the United States and all Hampton alumni that had law degrees and had that overturned. But she was raised up on that campus and it was always integrated. And she said the greatest impact on her life was performing in Washington, D.C. at Constitution Hall. And then the other thing I thought about was that here we are, again, in the 30s, he's taking them all up and down the eastern Atlantic coast into major cities, Philadelphia, Boston, New York City. And these are PE majors. They're untrained, they're not professional trained dancers, and so they're getting reviewed by major dance critics of the time. Can you imagine the impact it had on those students' life? I don't think there's any college program can ever boast that degree of performance experience that they had. So they were creating history. And, even if they were, she did not mention that they had any adverse reactions from any audience members. So again, I think it was just, the whole legacy of Hampton and that whole process that was set up by General Armstrong and carried on by Booker T and continued throughout their whole time frame. So I think that the overall experience was just a powerful thing.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you so much for that. Really wonderful response. Our next question comes from Laila Sales. Laila?
Thank you, Dr. Warburton. Hello, Dr. Laverty. How are you?
I'm great.
Wonderful. It's such an honor to speak with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. My first question is, what eventually happened with the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group?
Well, Charles Williams actually stepped back as the director in 1948. He's going to continue to act as department chair until 1951 when he resigns, or not resigns, retires, sorry. And in that time frame, they're going to get in several different instructors, one coming from NYU, who was sent down by Martha Hill and she was there for 2 years, and the thematic material changed significantly from the Afrocentric concert stage material to that of something like one of the pieces that sticks out is Christmas Eve in a Toy Shop. Now, that's not going to resonate very well with the audience who's been coming to see the dance group, as well as the dancers themselves. And in a letter to Mr. Williams, one of the students said she was a fine instructor, but she felt that she had been pushed out. And then the next instructor came, and they called her a, sorry, quote unquote dud. But what happened is when Charles H. Williams finally retired in 1951, and in that time frame he was still setting up some tours, but mostly just local and regional tours. Nothing to the extent ever from the time frame that he was directing the company. And then eventually, when he retires, it kind of goes into a temporary chaos where they're losing dancers, and to the point where they had to cancel their performances. And then the spring of 1952, they finally are starting to get some stability with a director who's going to stick with it for several years. And then finally, they're going to get Gene Braxton, who just retired from Norfolk State as dean, and Enina Butts, who continued with the group into the 90s. And they would tour the group, and they had gone back to more Afrocentric thematic material for the concert stage. Also, right now, it is still in existence. It goes by the name of the Hampton University Terpsichorean Dance Company, and that name change probably coincided when the Hampton Institute changed to Hampton University in 1984. They are considered a student organization on campus. There is not a major or a minor in dance on campus. There is still a director and a co-director. They do local performances and a lot of performances on campus, but mostly schools in the area and that type of thing. They are a founding member of the Black College Dance Exchange. Most of the choreography is student initiated, with some guest artists coming in, and a few pieces by faculty too as well. But they're still in existence, and the technical ability of them is pretty strong.
Thank you so much. My second question is in two parts. What is the legacy of Charles H. Williams on the current campus of Hampton University? Are the students, faculty, and staff aware of his numerous contributions, both academically and artistically?
Well, I do know that there is a course that is called University 101. It's required of all incoming freshmen, and it does teach about Charles H. Williams. I'm not sure to the extent of how much they cover him, and it's of course taught by different teachers, so they emphasize different things. However, about maybe 10 years ago, I had met the current director, and I started telling her his story, and she's like, this is so important, we have to write a grant. So in 2018, we were given a grant by the Virginia Commission of the Arts, and the grant was to raise visibility of Charles H. Williams and his contributions, both on campus and in the greater dance world. And in the meantime, in that whole 10 years, we had been submitting grants through Hampton University as well, and they were never funded, but it was finally funded through the Virginia Commission of the Arts. And in that grant, the task we were supposed to complete was to reconstruct some of the original dance pieces of the company from 1934. So through his extensive notes, through photographs, beautiful photographs in the archives, and newspaper reviews and descriptions, I was able to reimagine or repiece together several of the pieces that were with the original company. And then the other thing that we were supposed to do was to create a documentary. So we did create a short documentary of that process, and it is available on YouTube. So that, and now, because Charles H. Williams had such a longevity at Hampton University, he was literally there from 1906 until the 70s. Because after his retirement, he continued in the position as a board of directors, and he was still involved in a lot of fundraising on campus. And because of his multifaceted career, not only was he an athletic director, department chair, researcher, writer, founder of the Hampton Institute Creative Dance Group, founder of the CIAA, founder of the Hampton Musical Society, businessman, hotel owner, hotel association president. Because of these multifaceted aspects of his career, this new grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities, which just starts this month, will build a research database that centers around him, centers around the multifaceted career. I also forgot to mention architecture, because he came to Hampton University or Hampton Institute as a painter and was involved in many of the buildings on campus and refurbishing the buildings on campus, and building his own community for widows of professors who had died on campus and had nowhere to live. We're going to look at all those aspects. The whole time frame is at Hampton, and how local and national events occurred, how he responded to them, how it was responded to in our community, and also push that information into the existing humanities class, so there is more recognition of him and the realm of contributions that he made to the African American community.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laila, for those excellent questions. Our next questions come from Carol Garcia. Carol?
Thank you, Dr. Warburton. Hello, Dr. Laverty. Such a wonderful opportunity to speak with you. I'm grateful for this opportunity. My first question is, what initially sparked your interest in Charles H. Williams? How did you first find out about him and his work?
Well, I went as a student to San Francisco State University in 1974, and in 1968, there had been riots on campus and the formation of an organization called the Third World Liberation Front. And what they were demanding was that there be more curriculum geared towards more people of color, and that more instructors were available on campus, and that more people of color were allowed to become students at the campus. And so when I arrived there, there was now a new African American Studies department, a Asian department, Native American group, and Mexican American group. And so when I first started taking classes in the dance department, I had actually gone there as an art major. But when I started taking dance classes, I was completely immersed into this Black dance experience and into the history of Black dance, where ballet, and there was one ballet class, one modern class, and those were secondary. So we were functioning primarily in the Dunham technique, and there was a large ethnic dance studies program, and the World Arts Academy was housed there, which offered like Bharatanatyam and Balinese. And so that was my undergraduate education, with not really focusing like in a hierarchical structure of where classical dance fell, so to speak. And so my heroines were Catherine Dunham and Pearl Primus. And so I had gone on to Mills College and got my master's, and learned the other modern techniques and the ballet history, and then eventually still continued to study the Dunham technique. And even when I was in New York in the doctoral program there, I was still studying the Dunham technique. And so I had wanted to focus on Catherine Dunham, and Pearl Primus was at NYU. I was there, so I was able to study with both those women, but I was really discouraged from doing that because they felt that I wasn't really contributing any new information to the field of study. And so I had pretty much finished my coursework and didn't know what I was going to do. I ended up going to Africa with Chuck Davis, and on my return, I had even forgotten I had applied to Hampton University. There was a call asking me to come down for an interview, so I did, and I was hired. And I noticed this photograph and this little, I think it was from James Haskins' one-page blurb on our synopsis on Charles Williams was hanging in this dance studio. And I was like, well, who is this? Because I really felt I was quite knowledgeable about Black modern dance, you know, not an expert, but at least knowledgeable. And I'm like, why haven't I heard of this person? And then we had hosted the Black College Dance Exchange that year, and we had two of the original company members. I had already mentioned Mrs. Elaine Cook and Silas Moore were speaking about him and telling about all his collaborations with Ted Shawn and all the people who had come to Hampton to perform and teach classes. And like, why haven't I heard of this person? And so my coworker, Nina Butts, sent me to the archives. And so I started going through those archives, and I was just overwhelmed because, you know, I had been floundering, like not knowing what my dissertation topic was going to be. And then finally it hit me, this is it. And so it was just, once I found that, then it was nonstop. And I could progress far forward.
Wow, thank you so much. My second question is, what guiding principles would you recommend and suggest to dance educators in K-12 and higher education in terms of creating anti-racist dance curricula?
Well, as I mentioned before, my undergraduate experience is really atypical because, you know, there's so much rhetoric going on now about dismantling, you know, white supremacy in dance education, and especially in the dance history. And like I said, I came from a nonlinear perspective. I came from where those other cultures had as much as important significance to me than as ballet did or as modern dance did. And I think because of that unusual, you know, beginning of my education, that I didn't have this hierarchy, and I didn't have ballet put it at the pinnacle of the top of the hierarchy of what dance is. And like, I hate that term where dance is the basis of all dance forms. Well, it's not. And the other thing, I just heard this fascinating lecture from it's Jabral Jackson, and he had his premises, and I think he's at Columbia University doing his PhD work, that he had found, you know, that there is Moorish, West African, and Egyptian influence coming up, and if there's Moorish influence on the architecture and the art, why wouldn't it be on the music and the dance as well? And the other thing, if you go back and you predate classical East Indian dance, there's treatise of the Natya Shastra back 1500s prior to ballet that has all the exact same positions. So you can't, I think that Jackson quoted Alonzo King as saying, Catherine de Medici just didn't kick a ball and all of a sudden ballet emerges in Europe. And you can have something as Eurocentric, but it doesn't necessarily mean white. So I think that people need to really do some research and bring in some more literature, not just the mainstream, you know, textbook of what the history of dance is. And for the students, start introducing, you know, different types of dance into the curriculum. And I think for instructors, need to maybe find something that's similar, like the East Indian culture and ballet. There's a lot of parallels, or say, for instance, take a Dunham class, because it's deeply rooted in ballet and modern too as well, with a distinct African voice. So look at your students, see what your population is, ask for help. You don't have to be the expert, and start trying to bring in things. And then I think you have to do an honest evaluation of your curriculum. And sometimes it's dictated by you know, your administration. Sometimes you can't help it. Sometimes you have free reign, you can do whatever you want, but take an honest look at your curriculum. What can you do to increase visibility of other people? And even if you're not an expert, acknowledge the contribution, and then take an honest look at yourself. You know, how are you listening to different voices in your classroom? You know, are you stereotyping body images and that type of thing? So I think you have to take an honest look at yourself and an honest look at and evaluate your curriculum itself too as well. And then just bring in more, as many other outside, you know, pieces of information, and dig deep.
Thank you. Love that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laverty, for their answers.
And thank you so much, Carol. Marianne, you and I first met at New York University when you were a doctoral student, and I was a newly hired assistant professor and the director of the dance education program. And in fact, your doctoral dissertation was the very first thesis committee that I served on at NYU. And you may recall that I had a lot of questions about the topic of your study. Initially, I wasn't entirely convinced that you would find enough information and data for a dissertation. You proved me wrong. Your persistence and your commitment to the historical significance and legacy of Charles H. Williams, and your belief, like we just heard you talking about, in the foundational role of the Black and African American experience in dance, really convinced me that your research would be an extraordinary contribution to the dance education literature. So I'm glad to say that ultimately you proved me right. So for all those doctoral students out there, don't ever let a skeptical professor stop you from pursuing your passions. Marianne, I admire your work so much, and I'm delighted that we've been able to share it as an exemplar of historically significant research with the next generation of doctoral students. Thank you so much for joining us for this inaugural Arnholt Symposium.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it so much.